Oh, this is Dustin DaHusky again, and we're going to talk about why cars from the 70s and 80s get a bad rap because we associate them as cheap pieces of junk on wheels. And I don't tend to think that could be the case. It really depends on a piece by piece example of cars. You can look at 10 Chevy Celebrities, and one of them is going to be built pretty shoddily. Or you can look at 10 Chevy Chevettes, and 9 of them are pieces of shit, but you might actually find one that it was actually taken care of by the factory to put together. So let's talk about interior components, interior space. I guess let's just begin. So 1970s, a lot of cars were still rear-wheel drive. So let's talk about interior space, shall we? You had still a lot of big cars, so, wide open bench seats. So you had a lot of ample leg room if you're the driver passenger up front or in the back. You still had a drive shaft tunnel. So that chewed up a lot of space, especially the transmission tunnel up front. You have enough leg room, just you don't have enough feet room to move your feet around. It's not until there's very, very few cars. Well, actually, the only one I can think of is the old Ford Falcon of the 1960s. That almost had a nearly flat floor. That was front engine rear wheel drive, but they were able to maximize as much foot room, which was great for it. The Corvair had a fully flat floor. Of course, it was rear engine rear wheel drive. All the shit was in the back, but perfectly flat. And it being perfectly flat did not diminish structural integrity. It was literally the roof, literally the pillars, literally all the structural bracing, and the whole body, because it's all unibody. So it literally supports itself incredibly well. So you don't need fancy shapes to create strength. We're not looking at STG 44 levels of stamping in terms of ridges and bumps and notches to provide structural strength with thinner sheet metal. You could also get away with just thicker sheet metal, but you'll get a heavier car. So with bigger cars, space is not an issue. Maybe foot space a bit, but that's still not so bad. Smaller cars didn't have a lot of space back then. Maybe that's why people thought they were shit, because they didn't have enough wiggle room for the average American mass, unless you're young. But then again, thin, small Americans do exist, so I highly doubt that was really the case. So I'm debunking that Americans thinking that the shitbox is really a small car, which can be. It's because some people are too big for a small car, and they really shouldn't have bought a small car, and should have kept with a big car. It's just, you either lose weight or you buy a bigger car. I don't know which. And it's probably easier just to buy a bigger car if you're American. But this is a time in the 1970s, particularly in the late 70s, when people were going to front-wheel drive layout. Chrysler with its 1977 Dodge Omni and Plymouth Horizon, which, I've been in a lot of those cars in the 90s. They weren't bad. Actually, they were pretty decent. And those were shit. Those were shit by people that remember them, and they weren't bad. Or even 80s Cavaliers. They're shit by today's standards, but really? They're not bad, but their interior space was pretty damn good. Because front-wheel drive, everything is up front. There's no rear drive axle in the back. So you actually get a more comfortable rear suspension that sort of cradles the car in rough terrain quite well. It's not to say that live rear axles can't be comfortable. It's just sort of an inherent design that doesn't warrant well for independent suspension because it's a live axle. It's just a tube. That's it. But everything's up front. So you have as much space in the front than you ever had before in a front-engine, rear-wheel drive car. That's amazing. And the rear passengers get even more space. That drive shaft tunnel is now reduced in size. Now it's only meant for exhaust. The exhaust now travels through there, so you get a little bit of heat from the exhaust, which in the summer sucks, but in the winter rocks because there's not much of heated ventilation going to the back seats. There is underneath the driver's seat, goes out from underneath the driver and passenger seat, but beyond that, not much, and it's not that very effective either. So as far as interior space, it got better when you went to front-wheel drive. And I think that's when a lot of Americans, especially with the Chevy Citation, became real big hits because they were medium-sized cars that felt American but were front-wheel drive. And people thought, wow, there's a lot of good space in here. It's really well suited for everyone. That's why they sold almost, 600, 700,000 Citations in the first year in 79. It's incredible. Little did they know that it was GM's first attempt at a front-wheel drive car and gave rise to the Toyota Camry. Without the Chevy Citation, the Toyota Camry could not exist. You learned something today. That's real truth right there. Japan bought a Chevy Citation in 1980, wanted to know why it was a big seller, and then realized they couldn't find much of any value out of that car that was good. And then they made the front-wheel drive Toyota Camry, which is in a time period of shitboxes that turned out to be one of the biggest seller cars in their history. So, Citation. Actually the definition of a good shitbox. They were good cars. But the perfect definition of they were all shit because they all came out of the factory. Shit. But that's for other sort of reasons. So interior. Let's talk about fabrics. So, in the 1970s, vinyl was still being used as kind of a basic upholstery material. By the late 1980s, vinyl was kind of on its way out. It was still used in the backs of bucket seats of many cars, so vinyl was still being used. It was not being used as a material to sit on much, or small pieces of it were still being used. But the 1990s, cloth was pretty much king. You couldn't find vinyl seats unless you were in pickup trucks, and even still, that was quickly disappearing. So, vinyl seats, and I can say this, because I grew up in a 60s car, and my Skylark has vinyl seats. You burn your ass real good in the summer. Oh! Like a fucking egg. My dad's 89 Cavalier had vinyl seats. Oh, that was even worse because it was black. So it absorbed all of the light, which, you know, in terms of that, retains heat. In the middle of the summer, black vinyl seats are just the worst. They burn your ass, but you know what? They didn't fall apart. Not that I knew of. Eventually, that 89 Cavalier, by 2002, the seats did start to split. But it also could be a lot of use, could be other things, but by that point, many manufacturers have been trying to find ways to cheapen out their quality. We'll probably get to that in a moment. But cloth. Cloth and vinyl by the 1980s were a mixed bag because sometimes the materials were just getting so cheap that they eventually wore out pretty fast. You might find some surviving 80s cars in relatively good shape may have advanced wear in bucket seats, particularly in bolstering and lumbar is lower back. Side bolstering on the upper of the seat, and then on the bottom, kind of thigh support. That would eventually wear out, almost to be non-existent. Yeah, I would say that was not maybe the best well-lasting quality, and that's with a lot of cars. So, seats being used a lot, yeah, would certainly wear out faster and didn't last long. And that was kind of across the board. So, in some cases, there is a bit of some truth with shit boxes. However, with some cars, some batches of fabric may be better than others. So, before I say that all fabric for cloth and vinyl seats, and even leather, were all shit during this time period, a lot of car interiors survived incredibly well. So I think it was just a quality issue. It's not so much assembly and design, it's just literally quality of materials. That's much like with our last episode with mechanical bits. If you subcontract, you might likely get more shittier quality material. And sometimes that material varies. And it may be good for 1 month, and it may be terrible for another. So that material will wear out in various ways, in various lengths of time, with various amounts of abuse. Sometimes the cheapest seats possible may not have any wear if the car was never beaten. As in, used aggressively. So, yeah, interiors of cars in the 1970s and 80s may not be that great, especially their plastics. Plastics are shit. My 67 Skylark, much of it's all metal, much of it's all vinyl, much of it's all carpeting. But there are very, very few pieces that are plastic, which I'm quite grateful for because I'm terrified to touch them. This is 1960s GM grade plastic. And I don't like to look at it because I'm afraid just looking at it will break it. But there's very, very few pieces in that car that are actually plastic. Some of the plastic components are really heavy duty, like the handle, like the knobs on window crank handles. Those are quite durable. I'm not too worried about them. It's the steering wheel. It's the steering column. Although steering column plastics, I noticed, are the more durable type of GM plastics. I'd never really seen a shattered GM steering column casing. Never have. But steering wheels, oh, they all cracked. And I don't grip that wheel that much because that plastic will come off just fine. And finding a replacement steering wheel for my Skylark is impossible. And I refuse to put on an aftermarket wood grain 5-spoke monstrosity of a wheel in a 60s era car, which would destroy me. And possibly the world. And the rear armrests in that car is plastic. And that's maybe the most brittle of plastic I have ever found in that car. What I would rather like to do is to remove these pieces of plastic, get a 3D scan on them, and then a 3D print replacements for these parts. I can keep the originals, create a file, put it online for public use, because you know what? These parts are not reproduced. So it'd be beneficial for everyone to get parts, which if you own a 70s and 80s car, a lot of people just 3D scan parts, release the file online so you can print as much as you want. It's just 3D printing is great. And it'll help you. And it'll definitely fill in voids in your car's interior, which original plastics just explode. As what DaHusky's RX-7, one of his side window defrosters on his dashboard just exploded. I don't even think he even touched it. I think it just decided to call it a day forever and exploded the grates on that vent. Inward or outward, I don't know. Apparently just pieces flying. And this is Mazda. And Mazda, I would say Japanese import cars of the 70s and 80s were probably the worst. I'm talking about small pieces that are plastic, like vents, maybe door handles. Those weren't that durable. Amazingly, their bigger pieces of plastic held up better, but the smaller stuff just doesn't seem to last. And with domestic stuff too, the same. A lot of components in cars in the 1970s and 80s on the inside were still metal to a degree. Until the mid-80s, things were becoming more and more and more and more plastic. But they were getting better at their quality, but they were still junk. They didn't last very long. This is a time when manufacturing across the board, import and domestic, were cheapening out. I like to say the 1960s is the pinnacle point of car interiors and quality. I don't think you will ever find a car with as much quality inside its interior than, I would say, 1974 and prior. Before then, you had some high quality materials besides plastic. But you had materials that will last the test of time. The only thing in my Skylark that I need to get redone is the front bench seat. Yes, my Skylark has a front bench seat. It did not get the Stratocaster or the Stratoliner bucket seats. Those were an option. And Alberta did not bother getting bucket seats for her car, so I got a rare seat combination for my car. And it's a pain in the ass to find parts for it, because it's a front bench seat for a Buick that they only made for 2 years. Yeah. So we talked about interior space, we talked about cloth fabrics, headliners. Yeah, they just stuck the most cheapest, god-awful material for a headliner onto cardboard or foam, sprayed it with spray glue, and eventually it'll just fall apart. It'll just eventually loosen up, sag, and then you just rip it off because you can't see the road, because it'll all sag. Or you use thumbtacks, and you thumbtack everything in place until one of them falls and you sit on it. Yeah. So, cloth, plastics, so-so. It's a 50-50. You don't know what you're going to get for an older car that you might find today, if it's going to be intact or missing or toast. Although, amazingly, you could restore any 70s, 80s car with proper time or proper period fabrics and vinyl. It's going to cost you a pretty penny, but you can certainly rebuild seats. Give a seat to anyone that knows upholstery. They will fix it for you. So, if you have a nice, intact, early 80s Dodge Omni, but with the most shittiest quality seat fabric you've ever seen, a rear bench seat would probably be good, because not many people sit in the back. But driver bucket might need some work. You can certainly get it fixed. It's going to cost you a little bit, but hey, modern fabrics, it's going to last you a long time. You may even be tempted to do them all. The rear seats on the Skylark are intact, and plan to keep them that way. Front bench needs to get replaced with new vinyl. and maybe some new seat cushioning on the driver's side and seat springs. But beyond that, it's a fully intact seat. It's just needs a bit of work. And in the 1960s, seats are part of your suspension because they're bouncy as hell. Most of it's all coil spring. So, what are we going to talk about with interiors for cars of the 70s and 80s? Were they really that bad? They look great in a brochure. They really look great when you look at it. But touch and feel, you would, feel plastic, feels kind of cheap. You can lightly scratch into it without much effort. Even shatter it without much effort. A few summers, and it's enough to crack on its own and biodegrade in a way that it maybe shouldn't. Like vegetable matter. You know what? There might be a little bit of some truth. However, it really depends on the materials used on that particular car. You might find a Ford Pinto with some god-awful quality. But you might find another that held up pretty well. It really depends on really the batch of material being used. It's like I mentioned about the mechanical bits. All depends on what batch is being used and if it was done well. And if the car was well taken care of, it was not abused. If you take good care of any car of any age, of any type, even the most shittiest of Yugos, if you baby a Yugo, it will be a baby back to you, and it will stay in relatively fantastic shape without any issue. So as long as you don't treat it like shit. Actually, it's kind of the word for any car. Interiors. They weren't that bad. They often enough didn't fit. Panel fitment was god-awful. Even in the 90s, panel fitment for cars was pretty bad on the interior. But that's to be expected. Nowadays, everything is so neatly put together. You can tell something's been fucked up when nothing matches, but back then it was the norm. In fact, you know what? Here, I gotta show you something. Let me show you something. I have so many. I've started a GM sales brochure collection not too long ago, and it's addicting because you know what? I do miss these cars from the 70s and 80s period, and a bit of the 90s, because you know what? It's stuff I kind of grew up around and with, and a lot of that stuff has disappeared. Let me see if I can get... Okay, so here's an example of an 83 Celebrity interior. Look at that. Look at that. See, that looks pretty nice. It's not so much shitbox looking. They want you to buy this car. They want to make sure it looks great. Maybe the plastics in here may not look so good, but it's eye candy to your eyes. And it doesn't look that bad, especially when you have a brown interior with a brown exterior car. You got yourself a rolling turd. So, from this example, I can see that every panel fits well. Because, of course, it's meant to be a car to be taken brochure pictures with. They want to make sure they're taking the best picture, best example. I don't think I'll be able to find anything from this exact brochure, but on one Celebrity brochure, I think from 1982, there is an example of an inside view of the upper dashboard, and none of the speaker grates and the window defroster vents, none of them were flat. They were all wavy, so they were all warped from the factory. That's the kind of shit that you see with cars, but people were a bit more complacent. They didn't care so much. They thought, oh, well, it's okay. Hey, overall, it's a good car. I'm not going to complain. And people were more like that. Nowadays, people bitch about something not being put together well, which actually is kind of nice because we get better quality cars that way. But back in the day, people were a bit more complacent, so manufacturers were able to get away with building some of the most horrible shit they could possibly make. Not to say this on the celebrity on its as not as a particular example. There's some good celebrities out there that are built incredibly well. And with any other kind of car as well. But they did make some shitty interiors. So 70s and 80s, it's hit and miss. Okay. Because that's really the part of the car you're going to be sitting in all the time. You just can't sit outside the car and drive it. You're sitting inside, so anything that you sit on, touch, feel, and operate is everything on the inside. So maybe that's why people think it's a shit box, is because it doesn't look like a box, and because it's brown, it looks like a turd, so it looks like shit. They might be referring more to the inside more than anything else. May have some internal and mechanical gremlins, and maybe stuff on the inside don't. It's not maybe well finished, or matched, or assembled. I think maybe the whole stigma behind this time period happens to be interior, from my perspective. Hell, my babysitters had 2 Dodge Omnis, and not a single one of them had a working interior door handle. So, through rain, snow, sleet, and hail, every single damn window in those Omnis were open. Every day for years and years. Oddly enough, didn't destroy the interior. I don't know. Oh, wait a minute. One car had... How the fuck did that work? One car had exterior door handles that didn't work. One car had interior door handles that didn't work. And they kept them both. This is the 90s. Yeah, I don't get it. I thought it was weird having to stick your hand out the door to open the car from the outside to get out. And then when you're in the other car, you realize, oh, well, this door doesn't work on the outside now. Oh, it works on the inside. It's character on a car. Cars themselves were in really good shape, but then again, they were the 90s, so they were newer then. Didn't think the interiors of those cars were that bad, actually. It's just it was odd that for 2 of them, the interiors for those cars, they looked fine, just had issues. I don't know. I can see the reasoning why people call this time period shitboxes. I think a lot of the cars were going through a time period of manufacturers being cheap. They want to get as much profits out of these cars. And hey, if they can cheapen out on some materials and still make money, and people will still buy them anyway, they'll still put together cars. It's just it may not be so well put together and long lasting. So who knows? Interiors definitely might fill the bill, or might fit the bill, as far as, are they as bad as they say they are? Possibly. But there's still a lot of surviving 70s and 80s cars with great looking interiors that are original. So, I think it's literally on a case-to-case basis on how well a car was taken care of and what kind of materials were used at the time of its manufacture. So, in that case, we're going to talk about exterior stuff. And I think that'd be pretty fun to talk about because this one's a pretty big one. So we'll catch you next time.